welcome to API Conversations. I'm Marsha Barnhart, your host for this episode. The Aerial Phenomenon Investigation Team produces 2 podcasts. The API Case Files podcast examines the investigation of multiple cases that have recently been completed or that we are in the midst of investigating. This program, API Conversations, however, is a podcast where we feature a one-on-one interview with a special guest. And my guest today is Dr. Joan R. Bird. I came in contact with Dr. Bird when I was investigating an Ohio case that involved a mother and her teenage son witnessing a close, fast, low-flying UFO. During my investigation, I found out that the mother had, in the past, numerous anomalous experiences and sightings, one of which was an incident that took place in the mid-1980s when she and her active-duty Air Force husband were living in Havre, Montana. The incident allegedly involved a UFO close encounter with a remote military site. During my efforts to determine if this incident had been reported, I found Montana UFO expert Dr. Joan Bird. Not only was she helpful with my case research, but she agreed at that time to an interview once her busy schedule cooled down. Well, that took a while, but just recently she had the time to speak with me about her book, Montana UFOs and Extraterrestrials, Extraordinary Stories of Documented Sightings and Encounters. Dr. Bird is a zoologist who specialized in animal behavior. She moved to Montana in 1973 to pursue graduate studies in zoology at the University of Montana and completed her Ph.D. in 1983. She worked as a conservation biologist for the Montana Environmental Information Center, and among other professional pursuits, she freelanced as a nature interpretation writer and has written numerous articles for scientific and conservation publications. But this next fact is where it gets germane to our podcast. When Dr. Bird was a teenager, her mother had a near-death experience. This triggered a lifelong interest in exploring paranormal and esoteric subjects. And although steeped in scientific materialism from her academic training, she eventually began to study and attempt to understand the inexplicable. As an avid student of unexplained phenomena, she became a longtime member of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. Noetics is a multidisciplinary field of study that brings scientific tools and techniques together with subjective inner knowing to study the nature of reality. Although my initial intent was to discuss cases outlined in her book, we quickly galloped off into the fascinating areas of consciousness, the nature of the UFO phenomenon, and observations of anomalous experiences. This conversation with Dr. Joan Bird was recorded on May 5th, 2022.
I come from a family with a lot of emphasis and interest on science. My father was on 3 engineering degrees, and my brother got a Ph.D. in planetary physics, and I decided to go into zoology because I had a great fondness for animals and was particularly interested in animal behavior and vertebrate ecology, and I did a graduate project in the West Indies looking at bird behavior and ecology. And then I went on to work in conservation for a number of years and did a lot of conservation work, but I kind of kept feeling like there was something else that was calling me, and there were some crop circles that happened up around Kalispell in northwestern Montana that got my attention. And I was kind of between jobs, and I was starting to do some writing, and I had a friend, why don't you investigate that and write a story for her magazine. She had a magazine called Crone Chronicles at the time. And when I started investigating it, I was like, there's something going on here that is really unexplainable and quite curious. So that kind of brought me into the UFO field. But I have always been interested in, I guess, things that aren't explainable by our current understanding. I've always been a seeker. I've always wanted to try to understand the truth of who we are, what we're doing here, what this is all about. And I have definitely used science to do a lot of that kind of exploring because it is a very good tool. But I feel like there are other ways to do that kind of exploring too that are more intuitive or noetic. I was involved with the Institute of Noetic Sciences, a community group coordinator for many years. And then my mother was a near-death experiencer. So that was definitely one of those events that is not explainable from the materialist scientific viewpoint.
How old were you when that happened?
I was 13.
Tell me about that real quickly, if you would.
Well, my mother was having significant heart failure, and they told her that she was going to be dead in a year if she didn't have heart surgery. And at the time, they really had not used open heart surgery much at all. It was quite new on the scene, and what they did was closed heart surgery, which meant that they operated on the heart while it was still beating, rather than putting the body on a heart-lung machine so that the heart didn't have to be working while you're operating on it. So it's a much riskier operation. I learned later that the survival rate for closed heart surgeries was 50%. They didn't tell us kids that at the time, but she did have a heart arrest after the surgery, and they coded, and they had to bring in emergency paddles and whatever and get her started again. And she was really technically dead for several minutes, and she didn't tell me until sometime later. I think it was about 4 months after that happened, when she was home and recovering one day. She talked to me about it, and her mother had died 6 months previously. And she talked about going down a tunnel with a light at the end of the tunnel and coming out at the end into this radiant light. And her mother was there to greet her. And whenever she talked about it, she always teared up. And I don't know, somehow I got the attunement, and that happens to me often sometimes too when I talk about it. And she said it was the most beautiful light and the most beautiful music she had ever heard. And there was another figure there that was luminous and so loving. She said, I have never felt so completely wrapped in love. And she didn't know who that figure was. She was a good Methodist. So she said, it might have been Jesus, but I don't know. No, I'm not sure. And they actually told her that she could go back if she wanted to. And she said she didn't really want to, but she knew that my sister and I needed her. So she elected to return and live for another 14 years. So it was so moving for her, and we already had almost a sister-like connection. So I just really felt what she was experiencing, and it just challenged a lot of the everyday understanding of what's real and what's not. You know.
Was your mother kind of open-minded to this prior to her incident, or did that open a door for her?
It really opened a door for her. After that, when I went off to college, I had an art teacher who gave me the biography of Edgar Cayce. And I shared that with her, and we both became very interested in his work. And also, we developed an unusual telepathic connection that was quite striking. It didn't happen frequently, but it did happen a number of times between us after that event. And, of course, she had no fear of death after that either. Yeah.
So you're probably talking about There Is a River?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
That's the book.
Did you... So now we're talking that you and your mother were both kind of open to the idea of what is termed reincarnation. We don't know if it's actual past lives, or I don't know if it's parallel lives that get hooked into us or whatever, but for lack of a better term, we call it reincarnation. Do you think maybe I know we're getting far afield here, but this is an area that I really find interesting. And when you're talking, if you just stay with UFOs, that's one little area, but I think this phenomenon is far more encompassing and far-ranging, let's say, than just a nuts and bolts tin can flying through the cosmos to come here. So
Absolutely.
I've always found that anomalous experiences, looking holistically, is pretty interesting to explore. And one of those things, people often come through the back door through the theory of reincarnation and that type of thing. So that kind of sounds like something that had resonance for you and I guess your mother, yes?
Yes, yes. And I had always been interested in things that are unexplained. Had done a lot of reading about ghosts and telepathy and the Parapsychology Association when I was in junior high school, probably, and high school.
Had you had some experiences that you realize now that kind of caused you, or did you just kind of come through that way?
It was, it's hard to describe, but it was almost like a drive, I knew that there was something there that I needed to know. And so I just felt called to read and explore and try to understand.
I know exactly what that's like. Like when I read Shirley MacLaine's Out on a Limb, I gobbled that thing down in one night. And I thought, oh my God, so much makes sense now because, up to that point, talking about reincarnation was just crazy talk. But it made so much sense to me, and I still don't know what it is exactly, how to explain it. But to me, it's part of my belief system now. So I find that, really an interesting subject. So here you were, you came from a pretty science-based, buttoned-down family, but open-minded, and you got into the field of science where you dealt with animals and plants and things of that nature, and you were always kind of open and interested in the paranormal. And so your first foray into that then was to look into crop circles, which is kind of one of the chapters in your book. The book that you have is, and we'll go through it. It's about Nick Mariana and his Montana movie, UFOs and the Minuteman missiles, crop circles, this thing called the Canyon Ferry sighting, which was kind of like Socorro, and a couple of contact cases. Now, let's drill down into a few of those. For example, this Montana movie. Now, I didn't know about that, but from what I can discern, apparently it was like the first moving pictures of a UFO, and it was in Montana?
Yes, definitely one of the first ones that came from the public. I'm pretty sure that the government had movies from before, but that was the first one that came from the public, and it received a lot of coverage, press, both in this country and beyond. There were articles written about it in London because there were a lot of sightings that were happening after 1947, after the Roswell crash, and other than that. Well, after the first nuclear bombs were dropped, really, that's when things really started to get very active. So there were a lot of people that were having sightings, but Nick Mariana happened to be a journalist who had this background and loved being on the scene for unusual events, and just happened to have a 60-millimeter camera in his glove box, which was pretty unusual. There weren't a lot of people driving around with one of those, and just kind of leapt into action because of his journalism training. And he also was at the Air Force Base during World War II, which actually it was an Army base, Army Air Force at the time in World War II, and later became Malmstrom Air Force Base. But he produced the newsletter on the base and was familiar with all the craft there. So not only was he a journalist, but he was very knowledgeable about what kinds of aircraft we have and how to recognize them and ability to judge height and all that kind of thing, which I kind of wondered about when I first heard the story. But after I found out more about him, it was like he was really an amazingly well-qualified witness.
Now, he took this in 1950, and he showed it to some of his pals, and
Right.
they talked him into contacting the Air Force over it.
Yeah, he was a very social guy, and he had shown it to kind of a sports group that was related to the Catholic Church, I believe. And then I think he was also a member of, I forget, it's in the book, Lions, I think it was. And so he had showed it to some of these social groups, and there was actually a journalist in there who said, well, you should contact the Air Force and let them know. So he did. It was that journalist that contacted the Air Force, and when they found out about it, there were orders that were given out to the Air Force intelligence officer at that Air Force base, or at that Army Air Base, to go get that movie and to not really say much about what they knew, but just to get the movie. And Nick Mariana's son said that for the rest of his life he regretted not having made a copy of it, because he did hand it over, and when he got it back, the best footage was gone. And there were a number of witnesses that testified to that account.
Now, this is about 15 seconds of decent video he got, and it came back only like half that size.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Now, tell the audience what Nick Mariana shot.
Well, yeah, he describes it as two silvery discs, and actually anybody can go online and search for Montana UFO movie or Mariani UFO movie, and they will be able to see it, because there are a number of places that it's posted online. And the documentary that it was included in, that was just called UFOs, was produced in 1956, goes into more length. And when I speak, I often show a clip from that movie, because it was at the time considered some of the best evidence for UFOs. Even in its shortened version, they tried to explain it away as aircraft, but they were able to get a very sophisticated analysis by an aeronautical engineer, actually, who worked for Douglas Aircraft. And eventually, I think it was in 1968, he actually published a paper on why this could not be any aircraft, because of the relative speed and the ability to, or the inability to actually see the shape of an aircraft, which, if it was going the speed that any of our aircraft were capable of at that time, one would have been able to see the features of an aircraft. And that was just not the case. So, yeah, so it was definitely proven not to be an aircraft, and there was really no other explanation for it. And they hovered for a while, according to his testimony, right there by what was Anaconda Smokestack, which is no longer there, in Great Falls, Montana, and right across from the ball field where he was the business manager.
Now, there were two discs, but he only caught one on camera, right?
Oh, no, they're both there.
They are. Oh, when I saw the footage, I only saw one, but okay, then I might not have been looking at all of it. So there were two discs that he
absolutely
got 16 millimeter film of, and he handed that over to the authorities as a good citizen would at the time, and he only got a portion of that back, and it wasn't the best portion, and he never could get the rest of it from it. I don't even think they admitted that they had more, right?
Right. But there was somebody, I wrote about it in that chapter, who looked at the film, and because of the way that it was edited, could tell that there had been some editing done to it. And I don't remember all the specifics, but somebody had done a careful analysis and really discovered that there had been some editing on the original.
That when I was reading your book, I remember, being so disgusted with the fact that the military, I know they have secrets and things like that, and they have to be very circumspect, but just out and out lied. They confiscated the material. They knew damn good and well that what they were looking at was not one of their craft, and they were pretty sure that it wasn't anybody's craft, that it was an unknown thing, and they kept that, and that became one of the reports in Project Blue Book, didn't it?
That's right. It was one of their showcase pieces. that, along with the other film that came from Tremont in Utah, and that was from a Navy photographer who was off duty. Trying to remember what his name was. It's not coming to mind right now. Newcomb or something like that. And they wrote that one off as seagulls. And when the Navy did the analysis of it, they said actually that their conclusion was that whatever these objects were, they were self-illuminated, which kind of rules out seagulls.
Uh-huh.
That's how they wrote it off. When they presented it to the Robertson panel in 1953, those two film footages were considered some of their best evidence. And at that point in time, Blue Book had come to the conclusion that we were being visited by extraterrestrials, by off-planet civilizations. That was their best analysis, given looking at the best cases that they had. But they were supposed to report to the Robertson panel, who were purportedly these neutral scientists who were highly skilled and experienced and incredible. But as it turns out, they were pretty much all working for the CIA. And at some point down the line, one of them said, yeah, they told us what our outcome was going to be before we ever looked at any of the evidence, which would be that more study is needed, that we really don't know what's going on, and that they came up with explanations for both of those pieces of film.
We can realize that for a long time, since the 50s and maybe even before that, it's very possible that the U.S. government has a treasure trove of videos and film of these objects and has gleaned an awful lot of information from it. I don't know that stuff is ever going to see the light of day, even with the so-called disclosure movement and so forth. What's your thoughts on that?
I hope it's there somewhere, in a drawer. But who knows? That's a long time ago. But I do think that, somewhere a lot of that evidence has been brought together, and it's just hard for me to believe that it would have been destroyed. But I don't really know for sure. And the current disclosure thing, I'm kind of waiting and seeing. It seems like an awful lot of the press that's coming out is emphasizing more the fear, which is not unusual because that's what the military is expected to do, is protect us. So there's more of a sense of, they called the UFO investigation, the Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And then some of the articles that have come out have emphasized that people have gotten burned, and there have been some negative effects from people having contact cases, and lots of people. I would say the majority of people that have had contact cases have PTSD because it's just a shock to their understanding of the nature of everything. John Mack, who was a brilliant psychiatrist at Harvard, who gave a lot of legitimacy to the subject because he took seriously these people that were having these contact cases. He called it ontologic shock. Ontology meaning our understanding of the nature of reality or the nature of the world. And that when they found themselves being beamed onto a spaceship or waking up on one or seeing a ship outside the window or seeing ETs or whatever, that it totally shattered their understanding of the nature of reality. And that is trauma to anybody. That's, a traumatic event. We're all kind of going through that as we all adjust to the fact that this really does change our understanding of everything.
Yeah, those people who dare to go there, there's an awful lot of people who don't entertain that 1 millisecond of their life. They just never go there. But thinking people, I believe most thinking people know something's going on, but at this point we just do not have the knowledge to understand. It's beyond our ken. We just can't get there right now. We just don't have the tools to make a leap to understand a lot of that stuff. And people who have had those experiences and have been so traumatized by it, they can't even make sense of it, even though it happened to them, because these otherworldly experiences are almost impossible to translate into the human mind. From speaking from experience, I would say that you kind of get downloaded with information that, well, at least in my experience, information that was complete and whole with a breadth and depth, and you understood it all for just this tiny fraction of a second, and it was just, you were left agape by it, and then boom, the whole thing's gone, and all you knew was that there was some extraordinary download of information that wasn't linear. The human mind learns things in a linear fashion, and it's precept upon precept upon precept, except when you're working in this other reality, whatever this is, and I do not know what it is, whatever that other reality is, you get complete, full download and understanding with an entire coloring of everything all at once. And the human mind, the brain, doesn't know how to work with that. So
it changes people. It changes people.
Yeah.
Significantly. Mm-hmm.
If they accept that happened to them, it has to change them. If they don't accept it happened, then they can just turn that off and they can go about their daily lives. It'd be interesting to understand, to find out, and there's no way we could do it, just how many people have had an experience like that and have kept it to themselves because, one, they don't want to think they're crazy, and they could be, and two, they don't want other people to think they're crazy because they could be. It's just a lot for the mind to grapple with. But yeah, I think John Mack did some tremendous work there when he said, I believe these things are happening. I believe these people believe it. And in my experience as a practicing psychologist, psychiatrist, they are not making this up. So that was very helpful.
Yeah, he's one of my heroes. But just to go back to the Robertson panel, and the outcome of their listening to all of this was to recommend that there be a program to convince people that this was not real, and to hire psychologists and scientists and celebrities and people that could convince the public that everything could be explained, and anybody that had sightings was a little bit suspect, either wanted attention or maybe didn't know what they were talking about, not very smart or whatever. And I guess one of the things that really strikes me now is how incredibly effective that program of disinformation was.
Yeah.
Because people are still affected by it. And it has just given me, I don't know if respect is quite the word, but just awareness of the skill that is available to powers that be that want to convince us of a particular point of view. And it's made a lot of us in the UFO community very wary of mainstream news, because we just know how skillful and experienced these powers behind the scenes can be in convincing people of what they want them to be convinced of.
Yeah, I had an interview with Dr. Alexander Wendt. He's a political scientist at Ohio State, and he wrote this piece of work called The UFO Taboo. And he was talking about how people up to this point have simply not talked about it because it is such a taboo, because there has been such a very effective disinformation program to make you think that you ought not talk about it. So you self-censor that. For a long time, people self-censored that, and it was only the fringe wackadoos that would talk about it. But that is a very real taboo that is still in effect with an awful lot of people today. I've had people look at me and say, Marsha, I thought you were a smart person and you believe in UFOs? That's really? And they just, but yeah, it's a taboo. Yes, that was a very, very effective disinformation campaign that has been ongoing for an awful long time. And it was, wow, it was a prize-winning approach because it really worked.
Yeah, it is impressive just how effective they can be with convincing people of a particular point of view, and using the mainstream media to do it. They had, the CIA had implants. The Church Committee actually did this investigation, and they had something like 300 journalists on staff in major newspapers around the country to make sure that the kinds of articles were being published that would keep people from thinking things they didn't want them to think, I guess. It's a topic that I wish people were more aware of the extent to which they can be and have been fooled, because I think it's still going on. But the whole thing about John Mack and giving it legitimacy, he was the one who also he did put his career on the line and said that they were not otherwise mentally ill and that their affect was so intense that that's something that you just can't make up. And he wrote 2 books. One of them was Abduction, the first one about this phenomenon. He'd actually written another book before then about, blanking out right now, but he was kind of an expert in teen suicide and teen depression. So he was, a polymath. He had a lot of different skills and a lot of different abilities and awareness. And I was attracted to some of his writings because he just had such a philosophical and consciousness understanding of what a huge phenomenon this was. And after he died, there was an article in the Psychiatry magazine talking about John Mack, and it was actually somewhat derogatory. It said that he'd gone native. And, which is what they used to accuse anthropologists of when they would be studying a culture, and then they would become so connected to the people in that culture that they just kind of adopted it.
They lost their scientific objectivity?
Well, they just changed into, their worldviews changed. And that was considered to be going native and considered to be losing the scientific perspective. But I don't think he ever lost that. He just realized that what they were saying, there was not any other explanation for it, is how he put it. I don't have another explanation for what they're experiencing other than what they say.
Yeah.
And as he began to listen to them, it just really opened him up to a whole other reality. I was privileged to have a short audience with John Mack. I was reading Abduction. We were in Boston at the time. My husband had some connections with a fellow at the Ecopsychology Institute, which is, I was just hoping to go in there and get some brochures about ecopsychology. I want to find out more about that. And we were offered some time with him, and I was utterly thrilled. And we went in there, and he was looking very tired because he was working on the galley proofs for Passport to the Cosmos, which was kind of a summary of a lot of the cases that he had reviewed and looking for the similarities among them, whereas the Abduction was case histories, which is fascinating. But Passport was more of a distillation of some of the common themes. And when we got in there and he said, "What are you here for?" I said, "I am totally fascinated by the information coming from the contactees." And he said, "So am I." And we were off and running and talking about it because I'd worked in conservation for many years, and he had a whole chapter in his book. I didn't know about that at the time because the book wasn't out yet, about how so many people that have had contact experiences, been abducted or whatever, are told what a precious jewel we live on, how it is considered to be just this treasure of biological diversity throughout not just the galaxy but beyond, and that they were appalled at our lack of understanding of what a jewel this was, and of our treatment of the environment, our pollution, the toxins, the abuses that have been ongoing for a long time. And that, to me, was so encouraging, having worked in conservation for a number of years and feeling increasingly discouraged about people not caring, not paying attention, not being aware. And to hear that was just music to my ears. But there was so much more to that. He also wrote a chapter called Returning to Source about people's experiences of a spiritual nature. And while what we're seeing in the press now is some of the negative experiences that people have had, there are actually, the majority of people have actually had very positive experiences. And this chapter was utterly fascinating to me. After that interview or that time with him, when we got home, he sent us galley proofs of Passport to the Cosmos, asked us to read it. So I didn't do anything else. I just sat down and read it cover to cover. And when I got to that chapter, Returning to Source, I was totally blown away, very moved that all of it's like I had been carrying around all of my life this bag of events and things that just didn't fit the scientific materialistic paradigm, which I had been steeped in graduate school, that everything is based on random blind chance. Mutation is random blind chance, and natural selection, survival of the fittest is how we get the whole biodiversity, everything that's here. And something had always not quite rung true with all of that. But when I read that chapter, it was like everything fell into place, and it wasn't like there was a physical reality and a spiritual reality, and they were separate realities that were in conflict with each other. It was like suddenly it all became a spiritual reality, and the physical reality was just a subset of that, just one aspect of this greater, all-encompassing reality where all the pieces fit. And it resolved this conflict and this area of disharmony in me immediately, and I wept. I sobbed. I was just so, it changed things for me so hugely. It was such an epiphany. I called up a friend and said, can I just go sit at your cabin and sit by the creek for a couple of days? I need to integrate this. This is one of the most important things that's happened in my life. And that it was a very powerful impact on me. So when John called me a few days later and said, well, what did you think of the book? And I said, well, it was life-changing for me, John.
Now, how long had you known him before he died? Was that sometime before he ended up dying?
That was 1999, and he died in 2004. I had actually hoped to go and study with him. I started taking counseling classes because I wanted to go and intern with him and do what he was doing, and was horribly disappointed when we lost him. He was an amazing soul in many ways.
Now, that I think about that, and I kind of contrast that to Jacques Vallée's take on this. And he's got a very deep interest in this. And
yes.
His take is more that a lot of this is, for lack of a better term, illusion, that there is some type of system in place, a management system in place that seems to be guiding humankind for whatever reason, and almost maybe around by the nose, leading us around by the nose, that there has been what he considers absurdities in a lot of things that contactees have been told that on the face of it don't make sense, and then when you dig down into it, it doesn't make sense either. Jacques Vallée, as you're probably well aware, seems to think this whole phenomenon is far more than aliens from another galaxy coming in here to teach us to love our planet. So I was pretty happy when I just thought, oh yeah, aliens are here and they're well advanced and they're going to help us understand ourselves and our world better. And then the Jacques Vallée thing comes in and says, I wouldn't be too sure to put all your eggs in that basket, because it may not be that at all. It may be that's what they want you to think. So I just don't have a firm grounding in anything anymore. What's your take on that?
Well, Jacques Vallée is such an amazing, interesting character. And he was one of the first people that started talking about how he thought this was more of a multidimensional phenomenon, which was really, that was just a whole nother leap for people to try to get their minds around. And I know early on there were people that when they would learn that the spaceships would come in and out of physical reality, that was just too much. That's too weird. If they are able to leave physical reality, they must not be real. But he was one of the first people to talk about, and he's written so many books, but one of the early ones, he said, there's something going on here that just doesn't work in our physical 3D dimensions. He's very knowledgeable and very bright, and I definitely agree with him that there are many different agendas out there. But I do think that one of the things that's happening with contact is we are being opened to understanding that we live in a multidimensional reality. But that's part of what we are being taught by being introduced to these advanced beings that come from either off-planet or from another dimension.
Yeah, I do think we have to be very wary. It's easy to be duped. I mean, I'm sure you've talked to some people who are completely gone on the subject, and they'll look up in the sky and say, the Alpha Centaurans are right up above right now, and they really believe that. And well, it could be, but it could be that people have just lost their entire equilibrium. So a person has to be wary. One of the things that always stuck in my craw was when some people who I call them experiencers have been told by these aliens or whatever, we can't affect things that go on in the earth. We have to be hands off. You guys have to learn this on your own. And I'm thinking, well, hold a second. If aliens are supposedly abducting people and doing things to them, then this is not exactly hands-off behavior. So that doesn't make sense. There's things that just do not make sense.
Oh yeah, it's full of wonderful puzzles, and the thing about the hands-off, I don't know. There are a lot of witnesses that say that there were treaties that were drawn up or agreements that were drawn up, and that they were given permission to do abductions in exchange for technology, and that seems to be a pretty good explanation, because the whole idea of prime directive, that you do not interfere with the evolution of another intelligent species, is something that we hear a lot about. And yet we also hear that there are many, many different civilizations and beings out there, and they all have different agendas. And all of their agendas are not benevolent. So there's that going on, and there does seem to be kind of a trickster effect happening. And then there's also within our own planet more and more evidence coming out that the Nazis had advanced spacecraft, and that some of the spacecraft that we've been seeing has been theirs. And then we have some of these mind control programs that are capable of all kinds of nefarious activities in affecting people's thinking and giving people experiences that aren't real.
Right.
So
that it's humans doing that and assigning that to alien activity. Yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe both. Maybe they're in league with each other. It's hard to know, and there's so many different accounts and stories. I just kind of wade through it, but I'm very interested in the accounts from people that have ongoing contact with a being that claims to be from a specific place, like Alpha Centauri. And I think one of the things I like to do and like to do more of, is gather all those case histories of people that claim that they met somebody from Alpha Centauri, and put them together and see, okay, are we getting some corroboration here? Are they describing things about this planet that are common to many of these different accounts? That's one of the things that I like to look for, and I'm totally fascinated by learning about these more advanced civilizations, because many of them have gotten through the situation that we're in now, in which our technology has outstripped our morality and our spiritual evolution. Somehow they've managed to survive, and we need to know how do we get there from here? Because what we're dealing with right now is still dealing with a nuclear threat, even though I do hope there seems to be an indication and a lot of reports that they will not let us blow the planet up. But it could be that there could be an awful lot of destruction.
Yeah, I see an awful lot of people writing things, in Reddit and stuff like that the aliens won't let Putin use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Well, we'll see if that's going to happen or not.
Yeah, I hope you're right.
I wonder sometime if we're just so anthropocentric that we cannot see anything other than beings like ourselves, and so that's what we experience, because that's what we're expecting to see. Beings that have 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes, and they talk to us, and they seem kind of like super enlightened human beings. I don't, I am in a dark void when it comes to that. I'm just completely, I just don't know. I will tell you, I had an experience where I had this one time when I was living in Germany. My girlfriend and I, she was driving me home, and my husband didn't come with. He was smart enough, and so I'd had too much to drink, and I was sitting in the passenger side, and I had this spontaneous vision of the world having been destroyed in some god-awful catastrophe, some cataclysm where all that was left was just burning hot wind. Everything had been burnt to nothing. Everything was red. It was all ruined, and I understood. And I tell you, I wept and wept and wept at that scene. I couldn't even, these things are, you can't explain them in words. Now, I don't know why I got that, but I'd read later about how other people had had experiences like that. And I don't know where to put stuff like that. Hundreds of thousands of people can tell you stories like that.
Yeah. Well, those are unconscious fears, for one thing. Those of us that grew up in the time of nuclear weapons, I think that a lot of us kind of reported for duty, that we realized that the Earth was going to be in a very difficult time, and that the nuclear threat was huge. And I can't help but wonder if some of those visions or dreams are warnings to arouse us, to get us to act, to get us to wake up. I would hope that is the case, that they're not all prophetic. But from what I understand about prophecy, and especially about the timelines right now, is that it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen because there are so many different potential timelines. And everything that happens makes a shift in where those timelines go. There's something called Project Looking Glass. Do you know about that?
I've heard of it.
And supposedly it is a technology for looking into the future that wasn't ET technology. And there is a Navy SEAL who says that he was brought in to try to see if he could come up with a different outcome in the future than the people that were in black ops, that were government undercover people, that they were getting when they were running this technology, whatever it was, because it kept coming up with the same outcome after 2012, which was an ascension process, basically, or what else can we call it? A global awakening that was very positive, and that precluded any kind of top-down hierarchical power control on the planet anymore. So this is not something that the people that had access to this technology wanted to see, and they wanted to see if there was something else that could be done to try to change that. And this Navy SEAL said that anything that he did, it kept coming back to that same timeline, that this was something that was just destined for the Earth at this time.
I have a feeling that you are probably of a mind that this phenomenon is altruistic, or at least a positive thing. And I remember some time ago reading Dr. Carla Turner. I don't know if you were familiar with her, but...
Yes, I love her book.
She had a bad experience. In fact, the forms of intelligence, aliens, for lack of a better term, that interacted with her tried to get her to feel terrible things. They said they were going to kill her cat in front of her, and they wanted to apparently harvest these strong emotions from her for some reason. That's what she got. And in addition to that, she had experiences where she was taken to these chambers way down in the earth, and humans who were wearing military uniforms were in cahoots with aliens who were performing, some nasty stuff down there. And that adds to the what can you believe? It's all over the scope here. So, and I think she was factually reporting what had happened to her. I know she ended up she died from some aggressive form of breast cancer, but she had a terrible experience, and she wasn't the lone stranger. So I think, again, I'm just very, very wary to try to button down and think we have an understanding of what this phenomenon is, because if it was, I think if it was just creatures from another galaxy coming here and being interested in us, I don't know that the government would move heaven and earth to deny that those things exist. To me, there's got to be some other aspect to it that would be, to the most people, earth-shattering. I mean, like, for example, if it was absolutely proven de facto that, yes, we are in a simulation, we don't even exist. What we're seeing is avatars coming in here to tweak the game or whatever. I mean, a lot of people, that would cause them to just lose it.
Well, it is the kinds of language that we use to describe that also has a huge impact. And it's, as you said earlier, trying to find English words for this phenomenon is... It's
ineffable. This is an ineffable thing.
Yeah, if people, calling it what was the word you used, a facsimile, or if we are immortal beings and our life on this planet is about lesson, is about growing our souls, is that our incarnation on this planet is just one part of who we are, if reincarnation is a real phenomenon, and I've come to believe that it is, then yes, there is a greater reality, but that doesn't mean that this doesn't feel very real to us, and it's real on some level. It's real to the senses that we have for perceiving what's going on here, and it's possible that there is something going on from more advanced beings that is affecting us. But I also feel like that we are given a lot of power to create what we want. That power has been taken away from us by some of the programming, by the churches that say that all the power is in the hands of things that are exterior to us rather than part of us, that we aren't part of that divine heritage. But the sources that I'm most believing in now are saying that we are in a place where we are being challenged to take up the power that we actually have to create this world and make it into a place where there is much more prosperity, much more abundance, much more ability for people to fulfill who they are, to fulfill their purpose. And that the suffering has been something that has been inflicted, but has to move on now as we move to a higher level, as we move to another dimension, as we graduate to the next level. So I want to, I believe that whatever we believe, we help make happen, and we help make it true. So I try to be really careful about where I put my attention and my belief. I want to see a world that works. I want to see a world that has a lot of beauty and creativity and these problems being solved. And so that's where I want to put my attention.
Yeah. If the world is not a virtual simulation and when we die, that's it, there is no soul, game over, everything that we were told is just one part of the game. If that is not the case, then the only other thing I'm thinking that the government would move heaven and earth for us not to find out or be aware of is, I guess, regaining our own sovereignty to the point of where the government would have no control over us. And then what would that world look like?
Yeah, it would be a very different world. But
not everyone's going to ascend at the same time and be, kumbaya. So the mind reels at the possibilities.
Yes, yeah. And you have to be careful of the mind, as all the great spiritual teachers have told us, because it's not ultimately who we are. I want the bumper sticker, don't believe everything you think, because your mind is very busy with all the stuff that's been programmed and all the stuff that's floating around you, because we really aren't separate. We really are all interconnected. And I just think that there is so much evidence from advanced beings and from these advanced civilizations saying that we are on the spiritual path, that Earth School is a very difficult training ground, but a lot of us volunteered to come here, especially at this time, to move Earth to another level of evolution, which a lot of planets have been through. There are a lot of contactees saying that they've met other beings that have gone through the same kind of transformation that we are going through right now. And that's what makes the most sense to me, even though when I look at the media, and a lot of my friends around me are very frightened by global warming, and there's just so much fear that's propagated. But part of this transformation that has to come is changing from the fear, which is a frequency, and moving that into love, because they are mutually exclusive. And if we can get into that place of open-heartedness and more compassion, where our hearts are aroused by the suffering that we see, to the point that we just don't want to keep creating it anymore, that we can figure out other ways to solve problems, to resolve disputes. There is enough wealth, there is enough imagination, there is enough creativity. A lot of the problems could be solved that we're being faced with. But in order for them to be solved, the current power structure has to come undone. And there's a lot of resistance to that.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were talking that my organization, the Aerial Phenomenon Investigations Team, as a whole, we consider ourselves agnostic on the subject of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, because many people would say, and they would pretty much, scientists would say, there is, au contraire, there is no evidence that we are being visited by extraterrestrial beings. There is some type of phenomenon going on that we can't put our finger on, but there is no evidence of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And they would further say there is no evidence that there's any ultra-dimensional or higher dimensional goings on. And so when you're working in an environment like that, that is the environment we have right now, which is the scientific method. When you examine things by the paradigm that we operate under now, by the scientific method, there is very little evidence that all of what you say is true. There is an awful lot of anecdotal evidence that this type of thing is happening to a lot of people, and they're coming to these conclusions. But again, as Jacques Vallée would say, there is no evidence that there are extraterrestrials. There is evidence that some type of system is interfering with us. So I just don't know. I was at one point in time a lot more optimistic than I am. I don't know why that is, but I would like to believe it's simple as that, but I just don't know. And it very well may be, and we very well may have evidence of it that will come to light, especially with some of these Navy videos that have been released. These things that they're showing and reporting on, I think, are real nuts and bolts things. Now, they might be getting here through some blip through a permeable membrane from one dimension to another, but they do seem to be real things. It's not pie in the sky. So there is something going on, and different people have different ideas on it. I just don't know. But now, getting back, we've gone far afield. When we get back into the book, I want to talk a little bit about the case at Malmstrom Air Force Base. Yeah. That was one of a small group of Air Force bases in the mid-60s, maybe even in the mid-70s, some of them, that were having some type of true, real, factual, provable interaction with inactivating their warhead capability. Now, that happened in 65, 66, 67. There was a wave in 75, I think, and even 78 or 79, I think, in Ellsworth Air Force Base. These were a lot of these northern tier bases. Now, Malmstrom happened in 65, I think it was, and you covered that some.
67.
67? Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a significant, a very significant event. It's actually, when I found out about it, I was so outraged that there was so much evidence that this has happened, and yet it had been kept from us. That is what made me first start to think. I just thought, people need to know about this. This should be in our history books, not just in our history books, in U.S. history books. This should be in world history books, and it's happened all over the world. But I just also want to say about evidence, this comment that there is no evidence is insane to me. There is tons of physical evidence out there. But what we're seeing here is a collision between the materialistic paradigm, the materialistic worldview, and the worldview that consciousness is what is fundamental. And Max Planck said this, and he's a founder of quantum physics, and the quantum physicists know this. They are seeing this, that everything is connected, and that consciousness precedes matter. But if we are coming from that paradigm of only what our senses can perceive, even augmented with microscopes and telescopes and whatever, only things that we can measure, that the only things that are real in that reality, in that paradigm, that's all we consider as evidence. Whereas we have hundreds of thousands of people that have had contact experiences, and many of them have had physical scoop marks and scars and burns, and not to mention being healed, having amazing healings. There is so much out there, but if you are from a paradigm, the structure of scientific revolution, Kuhn wrote about it years ago. If you are invested in that materialistic paradigm, you will dismiss everything else as it's all anecdotal. There's nothing here, folks. It's all smoke and mirrors. And that is, as I see it, that is the resistance of the old paradigm to this new paradigm that we're moving into, where consciousness is primordial, and we live in a multidimensional reality. And the evidence for that from near-death experiences, from reincarnation, there have been such amazing cases of children who can take their parents to the places where their lives were before, or describe lives, and then they can go and have this verified. There is so much proof of that, and then there is the continued consciousness after death. This was something that John Mack was working on right before he died with Russell Targ. And Russell Targ was a Stanford Research Institute guy who was very involved with remote viewing. And Russell Targ's daughter, Elizabeth, died at the age of 46, quite young. She was a brilliant young woman who was doing a study of the effect of prayer on glioblastoma, a very rapidly evolving brain tumor cancer. And she died, and the two of them got together because John knew somebody who was a very close friend of Elizabeth's, and this friend started getting communications from Elizabeth. So, and Russell was very interested. Her father really wanted to hear more about this, and so they were investigating that. And in fact, 2 weeks before he died, a friend of mine, who was one of his co-researchers, as he called them, I called her and talked to her after he died, because there were a lot of people that thought that he might have been actually killed, that it was not an accident. And she said, not only was his father killed by a truck in New England, not in England as he was, but that 2 weeks before he died, he actually said he could do this work so much more easily from the other side, because he had become so convinced of this other reality beyond, this veil that's beyond that you move into. So I just think there's all kinds of evidence out there. And when people say that there is, I haven't read Jacques Vallée's most recent book, but I don't know, it has so much to do with our hearts also. What we can perceive has a lot to do with the consciousness and how much our hearts are open. And I know that John Mack was a very heartful person. I don't really have a sense of Jacques Vallée. He's brilliant. There's no doubt about that. And he was exploring things that nobody else was willing to explore, and suggesting possible explanations that nobody else was willing to go into also. But I just don't have a sense of how open his heart, what frequency is he vibrating at? I'm not sure.
Well, I do agree that the main issue right now is the old way of looking at things, the scientific method, where you need to you have to experiment, and then you need to have controlled situation where you can duplicate this. And so now that means you have to be able to have something happen on your command, and that is just not what this phenomenon is. I believe that our salvation is going to be found when enough of the legacy scientists die, and what comes up are those who are from higher physics. In higher physics, in quantum physics, you can explain more of this stuff that seems, spooky action at a distance makes sense way down there at the quantum level and farther beyond that. And we understand when we look at the wave function, if we can understand that any probability can occur at any point in time until you put your attention to it. And that collapse the wave function, now that's reality. One millisecond later, I will create a new reality. Now, that could very well mean that multiple realities beyond our understanding are going on simultaneously. We are like little tiny babies still crapping in our diapers, and we want to have the hubris to say we understand that this simply couldn't be because our, Newtonian physics or whatever tells us that this is impossible. That needs to go away. But when you bring that up, then scientists take umbrage at that because they are the old guard, and the fact of them is they're part of the problem.
Yeah, and well, it's understandable when your whole life has been built around the materialistic paradigm.
Yeah.
That's the reality that you were programmed in from the beginning.
It's orthodoxy.
That's absolutely. When you have been subjected to that kind of orthodoxy, then you are very resistant to anything because your whole identity is wrapped up in it. Your whole life's work and your ego is so identified with it being that way. And so, as I like to tell people, we don't like people messing with our worldviews, and we regularly die for our worldviews and we kill for our worldviews. And so this whole phenomenon really does challenge our worldviews. So I guess it's to be expected that there is a tremendous amount of resistance and a lot of noise about no physical evidence. When I hear the SETI people talking about that, it's like, you have a very, very narrow, limited idea of what you will accept as evidence. From my perspective, there's all kinds of evidence out there. Any kind of truth seeker wants to look at what's out there. I don't know how they can come to any other conclusion than that we are being visited.
An alien could tap them on the back, and if it didn't come from a radio frequency, it ain't real.
Yeah, John Mack was talking to a journalist at one point, and they were in Boston and out on the Boston Greens, and John Mack to him, he says, I think if a spaceship were to land right out there on the Boston Green, that you wouldn't believe it. And the journalist actually honestly said, "You're right, I wouldn't." The nature of belief systems, they're very, trying to pry open our minds a little bit and be open is just not easy.
What maddens me is the fact that as we're built, Homo sapiens sapien, with the particular set of equipment we've been imbued with, it almost seems like a sick joke to tell us, okay, now all of these governors we've put on your peripherals and your hardware and your software, all these governors we've put on so you don't see all this stuff going on. Now, guess what? You're supposed to let go of those. Some of these things you can't because you're literally hardwired to see the world in this very specifically narrowed way. And it's a sick joke to tell me now as this human being, I'm not supposed to look this way anymore. I need to somehow change frequency to where my eyes can see a different spectrum now, or something apparently is supposed to reprogram our set of operational devices.
Mm-hmm. Well,
What?
some people are experiencing that. Some people are experiencing opening of their third eye, being able to see into other dimensions. There's always been movies, and I think a lot of people are aware that there are people who can perceive through the veil, who see ghosts, or a lot of psychics, grew up with that, and they thought everybody was able to see the spirits. And then were very rudely awakened to find out that not only was that not the case, but they better not talk about it, or they were going to be considered too weird. And I know of a number of people who have been contactees and have had awakening experiences where their third eye is open and they are seeing things and getting these downloads like you talk about. I mean, a lot of people have had those experiences, and it changes them. They begin to question, and I'll tell you what, this reprogramming is not easy, but if you are a serious truth seeker, you just keep trying to make sense and move forward and listen to some of those that are way showing, people that are already having these experiences and are getting information. And I don't listen to just one. I listen to a number of them, because I'm looking for corroboration, and I'm always looking for the heart, because there's some part of me that just knows that is the most important thing, is we have to have more compassion if we're going to create a world that is not full of the suffering that the one we're currently living in is.
Yeah, it is good that you cast your net far and wide on that, because personally, people who channel entities scare the bejeebus out of me.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Sometimes I just... I don't, something about it does not seem right. It twinges my little BS meter sometimes. I don't know about that. Now, the contactees that you wrote about in your book, what really did they say was downloaded to them? And the Leo Dvorak and Udo Wartina.
Yeah,
tell us about what they got.
Well, it was... I included those two stories because one of the things I wanted to do was help allay people's fear, because there is so much fear about the phenomenon. Not that there aren't beings out there that I think do not have our best interests, but I would say that the overwhelming majority of them are benevolent, are advanced, and their experiences were both so positive. Leo Dvorak said they were the best friends he ever had, that his parents were German immigrants, and he was discriminated against in the 30s, first of all in North Dakota, and then later on in Montana. He lived later in Montana, so I could count him. And a lot of the kids made fun of them and shunned them. So they were very much impressed with these beings that were so kind. And one of the things he said about them, he said he didn't think they were capable of violence. And he always was so thrilled whenever he got to see them again, and just said that, I put that quote when I give the talk. He says, I just don't think that they are capable of hurting each other. It's just not part of their mentality. It's just not part of their reality. And then Udo, he told his daughter that he actually felt genuine love from them. And one of his friends said that he kept going back again and again and again, hoping that he would run into them again. So their experiences were both very positive. These beings looked human, and I think that the ones that they interacted with probably were. There are many, from what I hear of the many accounts that I've read, there are many human-looking beings all over this galaxy and maybe beyond. And there are some that actually change their form to look more human because we would be too freaked out if we saw what they really looked like. I hear that a lot too. But I think that those two cases, the beings had been coming here for a long time and coming here in human form, and they talk about the Pleiadians looking so much like us, and a lot of us being descended from Pleiadians. So
yeah, there's a long tradition in native lore about star people being our ancestors. Now, didn't these contactees, I think it was Dvorak, it might have been Wartina, didn't they get some downloads on some technological stuff?
Well, yes. Well, Leo writes about some of the things that he saw, which were like television sets, but also he had a strange experience of almost like bilocality, which is really bizarre, that he talks about, and about the chairs that he and his brother were so amused by when they finally got on the ship after waiting so long and longing so much to get actually on it, and these chairs that would scoot under them as they began to sit down. And so his little brother, who was 8 years old, was always trying to fool the chairs by seeing if he could sit down before the chair got to him. The chair would come scooting across the room, and then there were big screens like televisions, but we're talking 1932. That wasn't happening yet. And so yeah, he reported on a number of very advanced technologies that we still don't really know how to explain. But then Udo Wartna was a tinkerer and a very smart guy, and his friend said that he just loved to invent things. And he was quite curious about how this ship operated. So he was delighted to be invited on board and spent several hours there and wanted to know, okay, what is the power system for this craft? And they pointed out the counter-rotating rings around the craft that had magnets in them. And this technology of counter-rotation of magnets or magnetic fields, it's what makes a gyroscope stand up. It's the same thing. It creates, it's an anti-gravity technology is one way to describe it, but it creates its own gravitic field, which neutralizes the gravity of any field that's
immediately around it.
Yeah. So he was very excited about this, and he also had people that ridiculed him when he first began to talk about it, so he totally shut up. Both those guys were told that nobody would believe them until they were old men, and which is essentially true. But when we had the first big gas shortage, people were lined up at the gas stations. This was in the late 70s. Udo knew that he had seen a technology that would make gas obsolete, that would make petroleum, fossil fuels obsolete, which is true. That's another reason why we're not, that's another reason why there's nothing here, folks. This is not real. Yeah, there are some very powerful interests that really would not want these technologies to come to the fore that would make fossil fuels obsolete. But he felt a civic duty to try to let people know about these technologies. So he wrote a letter to John Glenn, and I wasn't able to get a copy of the letter from the John Glenn archive. He was not part of John Glenn's Ohio territory, so it may have been thrown out. But we have copies of the letter because he also sent a similar letter to Stan Friedman, who was a UFO researcher who just died within the last couple of years, and he was a great soul and a nuclear engineer, and was already at that time, this is in 1980, Stan had already made a name for himself as somebody who was a highly competent, brilliant scientist who totally believed that this was a real phenomenon and there was a lot of cover-up going on. And so he sent a letter to Stan Friedman as well. And in this letter, he talks about this technology and about his experiences. And that's the documentation that we have of him putting down in writing, in detail, a lot of information about just exactly what transpired. Yeah.
He finally felt safe enough to get it out to a person he felt would accept what he said without judgment.
Well, he just felt that it would serve the greater good in a way that made it more important than him worrying about what people thought about him. He saw that this was something that could change the world, and he wanted somebody to know about it, somebody that could do something to realize that there are these technologies out there that could end our dependence on fossil fuels.
Yeah. I've read a lot of accounts of people who have had interesting information they've gotten from aliens, for lack of a better term, and that they will draw these out and they will be obsessed with trying to get these things out, but the capabilities of the normal human and our manufacturing processes and understanding of physics at this time, it just is not going to allow it to be given birth yet to. Maybe some of those things, that will get cataloged in time. Somebody thought about, in 1920 and tried to write down and get a patent on, maybe they will in the future bear fruit. Who knows?
Well, there are a lot of people that say there are many classified patents that are exactly that. They are alternative energy systems, alternative medical systems that would totally put out of business a lot of those systems that are the power systems and the medical systems that are the money makers right now, and that they have been deliberately suppressed. And boy, that's just another whole field. When you go into that, some of these brilliant inventors and geniuses who have been told that their inventions would be built and promoted, and then they've sold the patent, and then they've disappeared, and there hasn't been any sign of them since then. And there are other stories of people who have died suddenly, who were otherwise healthy, that have been involved with some of these technologies that are such a threat. So I can't, there just are so many of those stories that I do believe that there has been heavy suppression of alternative technologies. And there are a lot of people within the UFO movement who are committed to it because they do realize that these technologies would end our dependence on fossil fuels. In fact, would make energy essentially free, and that would eradicate poverty on the planet as well. So we're talking big stakes here. Yeah.
Well, you could certainly posit the scenario that people who are making money and have the power, nobody wants to lose power. They don't give it up. And
right.
I certainly could understand that. Free power was one of the things that, God, what was his name? He was Alexander Graham Bell's kind of nemesis. Huge guy, very famous. What's his name?
Tesla.
Yeah.
You're talking, yeah.
Yeah. Now Tesla had some ideas that he said would be free energy. And, I remember reading a thing, whether it's true or not, that when he died, a couple of people came in and took all his paperwork, and that was that.
Yeah, that's the story. But there are also people who worked for him who continued his legacy as well. And there's actually a wonderful story, and I'm not brushed up enough on it to remember the names, but there are people that actually were able to produce a spacecraft which flew at least once in California by this fellow who was a protege of Tesla's and who worked with him in his lab for a long time. So I'd have to do some research to get you the actual names on that. But
yeah, there's talk about that. I don't know. That's one of those things we may never find out. Now, one other thing I want to talk about in your book is you mentioned some crop circles that occurred in Montana, and you went into some detail in your book about technologies that could be garnered from understanding whatever caused that. Now, as far as the scientific community is concerned, crop circles are in the bin of hoax. And they don't go any farther than that. Even the extraordinarily exquisite ones that have purportedly popped up overnight are in the bin of hoax. That's one of those things that people just aren't going to go there. But clearly, they might not all be. And was your understanding that those crop circles that were found that you reported on in your book, were they legit? What did you find out about that?
Well, the first one that I investigated, I became completely convinced that it was man-made.
Uh-huh.
And after that, I started investigating crop circles in general and went online and started looking at some of the best crop circle sites.
The first one you investigated, you came to a realization that it was probably a hoax?
Yeah, there were stakes in the field. It happened right after they had shown the Doug and Dave a documentary that was actually created to debunk, and that it was very close to the community college, and it just looked like it was a hoax. It was perfectly made, but I think they actually found stakes and twine in the field, and it was a fairly simple design. But the one that happened the next year in a wheat field about 4 miles away, that one, there were people that were aware of crop circles, and they went into that field, and they had the problems with the cameras, the compasses going wild. A lot of people lost their photography equipment. It was completely ruined, stopped working, and was not fixable after going into some of these crop circles. And then there have been a lot of strange sightings around them of balls of light. There have been beings sighted around them, and some of the earlier ones heard reports also of craft being in the area. And then sometimes we've had these messages that have come through in the crop circles that seem to be related to crop circles that have come before, or to things that humans are asking and putting out there. And Stephen Greer did some experiments where he was asking questions and got a reply in the form of a crop circle, and he took a group in England to be doing contact. And then we had in Montana, what happened was that the one that happened in, the first one was in 98. That was the one that was relatively certainly human-made. And then in 99 was this other one, and it's very similar to the one in 1998. It's very similar to the New Mexican flag, which is the Pueblo, I think it's the Zuni Pueblo sun symbol with the circle and the four, I think the sun symbol has 4 prongs off of each of the cardinal directions. And in the ones in Montana, there were 3 prongs, and the middle one was the longest. And they were symmetric in the one that was man-made. All the prongs are like all the other prongs in the 4 directions. But in the one that happened in the year 1999, you have one direction, I think it was the south, where there are no prongs. You only have 1 prong, 1 or 2 are the other directions, and you only have 3 prongs in one direction, which I think was the north. So it's asymmetric, and it's also a medicine wheel. It's divided into 4 quadrants, and the medicine wheel is a symbol for harmony and so many things, for life, really. The 4 directions and the 4 seasons, and everything is in 4s, and so other traditions, differing Native American traditions, have different ideas about, or different descriptions of what the medicine wheel is about. But they all pretty much talk about it being a symbol of harmony and of the whole, of the greater whole. So the fact that this symbol came back, and there were airplanes that flew over it that saw the impacts on their compass being disrupted. And then there was a woman who got into that crop circle and actually got some photographs of some kind of hazy figures in the field at night. So that one, we're relatively certain, was not man-made, and they also were able to get some plant samples. And that's the other thing that is characteristic, is that the plants have holes in them, expulsion cavities, where moisture within the plant is superheated and it explodes and creates these holes in the plant stems. And also the plants are bent rather than broken and continue to grow after they've been bent. So there are all these other ways that evidence that something is going on besides these plants just getting mashed with boards, which is what they insinuated with Doug and Dave.
Notable biological differences in the genuine ones.
Yes.
It does. That kind of is like a new understanding, I think. Some people who have studied that, a new understanding of heat or something, as I recall on that.
Yeah.
How it happens, they can't understand unless it's a huge burst of some type of energy, an immediate energy, that it creates that kind of phenomenon.
Right. Yeah, there are people that have hypothesized about how that energy is produced. lasers or some kind of energy devices that could also potentially be used as weapons as well.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Yeah.
Aren't they all? Well, what I find interesting is the little orbs that often accompany them. Those orbs,
Yeah.
I'll tell you, we have so many reports of those, and they are not all drones.
No, they're not.
And it's because of the proliferation of drones now and their capabilities, it's getting harder and harder to parse out what's one of those little orbs and what's a drone. It really is vexing when we're doing an investigation. But those orbs fascinate me, the genuine ones that seem to be kind of plasma balls, some type of plasma energy, not necessarily a hard material, that seems to scoot around under some form of intelligent behavior. They fascinate me. I don't know if they're organic or if they are some type of just, plasma energy that is being directed by some intelligence. That's the technology, is this directed plasma energy that can hold this discrete form and travel about under command. I don't know what it is, but so fascinating.
It is fascinating. I totally agree. And the whole idea of plasma, of what that is, my understanding of it, it's a charged gas. But I'm also hearing from other sources that it's sort of how the beginning of how things come into form. That is the stage. That's sort of the scaffolding from the consciousness level.
For materialism, how things become material?
How things come into form, come into matter, is through plasma. That's the medium that begins to solidify or can be solidified into matter.
That kind of dovetails. That reminds me of Edgar Cayce, how he said, and it seems to me true, that what existed before matter was consciousness, that consciousness created matter. Matter did not create consciousness. To me, that just rings true. You can't prove it yet, probably, but to me, that rings true.
That is exactly what Max Planck said. And he said at the end of his life, he said, I have devoted my entire life to the study of matter, and there is no such thing as such. This was after he had said that consciousness is primordial. Consciousness comes before matter. And, that's just the non-physical reality existed, and the physical reality is just a subset of that. That was the epiphany that came to me when I was reading that Returning to Source chapter in John Mack's book.
If we could get smaller and smaller when we look into quanta and beyond that, we're going to see, we already know you could drive a truck through atoms when you get down there, and it might just be smoke and mirrors at the end of it. And all there is consciousness that has created this fabulous illusion that we live in and get to enjoy and create. If we were put here to create, then it certainly gives us the opportunity for creation.
Learning how to be creator beings. I've heard it described, sometimes heard matter, sometimes described as frozen light. That frequency, slowed down of light becomes matter.
Yeah, now we're getting into vibrational frequencies, and that's a whole different thing too. Wow, It
is, getting way beyond my my ability to talk about it intelligently.
Well, we have ranged far and wide. Your book ended with essentially saying, okay, after I've examined all this, now what? So, and you say that the question then becomes, how do we proceed? How does science attempt to study a phenomenon that can't be duplicated or studied or measured? And that's what I was bringing up. You can't even agree on it. And so here we are in this netherworld of trying to make sense of stuff that we can't study. And then you throw in the fact that there's a consistent role of a willing media that's playing to hide information on stuff we should know. And then there's the military that's doing God only knows what. And so we're sitting here in this box trying to make sense of what's going on with all these forces really arrayed against us, trying to come to an understanding. And I guess one comes to this understanding by going in more than looking outward.
Oh, you're right on, Marsha. That is exactly what the conclusion that I've come to, too. And I see so many people being faced with what we're faced, really going in to find those answers, and coming, more and more people just coming to the conclusion that our only way out of this is more compassion. More, somehow we have to get beyond this us and themness and just realize that there's that we're all one, that we're all connected, we're all interconnected, and if part of us are suffering, we're all feeling that. And one of the things that's happening, I think, in the consciousness shift is that our empathy and our compassion is increasing in so many people, so that it's becoming unbearable to watch the suffering, to find out about the suffering, to find out about those horrible things that are going on underground. We just can't continue to allow it to happen. We want it to be different. We're like ready to move into another higher frequency on this planet. Yeah.
You know, my cynical side, though, is worried about it's as if there are nefarious forces at play, and I don't even know if it's human agency that these nefarious forces are, that have us so at each other's throat, the worst I can recall in the longest time, almost as if something is working overtime at keeping us divided. Because we could very easily come to accommodation with one another on any given number of topics if we weren't so stratified and so rent apart by something. I don't know what that is either, but you know, if one wants to go into the Bible and it's the devil and all that, I can't speak to that so much other than that's a philosophy, but it's almost as if there is some nefarious agency that is really enjoying stirring the pot down here for some weird purpose. And I don't know how to end that either, except to stop playing the game, stop being incensed over some silly little slight and not take umbrage, let it roll off and figure everything's going to be all right. I'll just keep my head down and keep trying to do good. I don't know how else it's going to get fixed. We can't keep going at each other. That's not a fix.
Exactly. And I think, I certainly arrived at that conclusion. We have to figure out another way. There's a great book out called The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible by a guy named Charles Eisenstein. And he talks about that. We just have to get over the whole idea of otherness. But the media profit from that kind of conflict. And we are programmed from the very beginning in competition, specifically in this culture, most especially in this culture, as opposed to other cultures that really do a lot more to encourage cooperation and collaboration, the value of that. But from the very start, we start our little kids and we're told all along that it's all about survival of the fittest. We are programmed with that. And we have to go beyond that and just realize, as a lot of biologists have come to the conclusion, that actually it's not about survival of the fittest, it's about survival of the most cooperative. We look at the species that have done the best, and it's the ones that are social species that have learned how to cooperate with each other. So there's that growing awareness happening within the biological realms, which is helping us open our minds, helping us question some of that programming that has been fed to us. But the media is so all about trying to find the two sides, the two sides, and it's just uncanny how often we are divided 50-50 right down the middle. How could this possibly be that we end up being so mathematically evenly pitted against each other? It's just, my best understanding of that right now is that is the lesson. We need to figure out how to get beyond that polarization, and that the media makes so much money off of the polarization, and perhaps there are powers that be behind that also realize that as long as they keep us divided, they can maintain their power. And that could very well be. So coming together is very threatening. if we can come together, figure out how to get along, how to solve these problems, because there is enough wealth on the planet to care for all of the humans that are here. And yeah, it might be an idea to decrease the population, but that could be done over time with education and with people not feeling so much fear about the future that they feel like they have to have 12 children. There's so many other planets have figured out ways to do this, so many other civilizations that we could learn from if we do develop diplomatic relations with some of these more advanced civilizations, which I hope will happen. There are people working on it, so may it be.
It remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about where your head is right now, really what you're working on and where you're giving your main energy and focus right now.
Well, I've kind of gone native. Yeah, as John Mack was accused of doing, I have come to believe that we are going through the shift that I'm hearing about from a number of different sources. I recently ran across a little book, and I'll put it out there because I think it's worth looking at and rereading it. It's called ET 101, The Cosmic Instruction Manual for Planetary Evolution, an Emergency Remedial Earth Edition. And it's kind of written, when I first read it, I just thought it was very tongue-in-cheek and cute. But as I'm reading it now, it fits with so many narratives that I've heard from different sources about what we're going through and how there are a lot of benevolent off-planet beings that are working with us, or many of us have ET souls and have incarnated at this time in order to help bring about this shift, to bring more light to planet Earth, bring more love to planet Earth, bring more compassion, more kindness. That when we live in that space of acting out of more kindness and not seeing other, but just seeing as you are another me, I am another you, we are all in this together. When we start living from that, we create a field, because it's all about frequency. And so when our hearts are open, we create a field, and the more coherent and calm and open our hearts are, the stronger and larger that field is. The heart math people have done some wonderful scientific studies on how they can measure that field that is generated by the heart, and how the heart has more neurons in it going to the brain, and the brain has going to the heart, that the heart has its own intelligence. And the indigenous people have always known that. They've always felt that our heart was our center rather than our brain. This culture, we think of our brain as being the center of who we are. But in many other cultures, traditional cultures and indigenous cultures, the heart is really seen as being the center. And as more people come into that place of working on whatever's in the way, the fears, the programming, the early childhood trauma, the bad things that have happened that we need to clear, as we clear and forgive, we bring the frequency up, and that affects everybody. So many of the people I know, we just feel like the more we can just emanate that kindness out into the world, the more we're going to be able to shift the overall frequency of the whole planet, and that impacts everybody.
I hope that happens. I, again, keep thinking we are so encapsulated in this body we were given and how we came through, that it is just a Herculean task to try to find our way into that mindset.
I do recommend that little book, the ET 101 book, because it explains it in a way that just makes a lot of sense to me, and I've just heard it from so many different sources now. I go back and read it. At the time, it was just kind of novel, and now I read it, and it's like, wow, this is, and it talked about how she changed her name. It first was published in 1990, and then it was republished in 1995 under a different name. And there's a little message at the beginning from Mission Control saying that, yes, we didn't really change that much of the text between the first edition and the next edition, but we did really change the author. So that as she was, and it's channeled, as this information was coming through her, it changed her.
Huh. All right. Okay, well, look, I appreciate you getting with me, Joan. I know it was difficult getting this coordinated, a lot going on, but I appreciate you taking time to talk with me.
And I appreciate your perseverance and hanging in there with me in spite of the fact that I've been going through lots of changes and doing a lot of inner work myself, and kind of feel like many of us are in that stage of the chrysalis where we are in the process of going from caterpillar to butterfly, and there's the gooey mess period, and I think it's lasting a long time.
Well, okay. Well, enjoy your gooey mess. Thanks again. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, this turned out to be a wide-ranging conversation, well beyond just the contents of Dr. Bird's book, Montana UFOs and Extraterrestrials. Whatever the starting point, it's always enjoyable to wander through people's thoughts and understandings regarding this phenomenon, and that we did. I hope you enjoyed the chat. By the way, further information on the book and the author can be found on our show notes page, as well as links to various incidents and topics discussed during the program. And that brings us to the close of this episode of API Conversations. I've been your host, Marsha Barnhart. Thank you so much for joining us. API Conversations is a spin-off of API Case Files. This podcast is a production of Aerial Phenomenon Investigations. The spoken content of API Conversations is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 4.0 license, as is the music heard during this particular program by DJ Spooky and David Allegro. Be sure to check out our other API Conversations and API Case Files podcasts at www.apicasefiles.com.